Welcome back to the Ed Morrissey Show podcast. We are just coming down to the tail end of the Biden presidency. Tail, I think, probably being a good description of what's going on here, because I think that it's pretty much ass backwards around Washington, D.C. right now. Lots of different stuff going on, but I want to take a little focus on the regulatory environment and what Joe Biden's trying to do in his final days, hours as president. Joining us to talk about that from the Daily Caller News Foundation is Nick Pope. He's a senior reporter for Daily Caller, and he's got a couple stories here that we definitely want to be talking about. The biggest of which, and I think the most well-known of which, Nick, is the offshore drilling ban that
Well,
Joe Biden
absolutely.
ordered. Now, this is a little tricky, right? Because normally you'd say whatever president can do instantly, a following president can undo pretty much instantly. But that doesn't seem to be the case here.
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks for having me on the program, Ed. So, for those who may not know, the White House announced at the start of this week that President Biden, using a statute that's about 70 years old, would be protecting, i.e., taking off the table for future oil and gas leasing activity, approximately 625 million acres of federally controlled waters. This is up and down the East Coast, off of the West Coast of the United States, part of the Gulf of Mexico, and then also up in the Bering Sea in Alaska. So that's a absolutely massive action, particularly in the waning days of the presidency here. And as you alluded to, the particular law that President Biden invoked to make this happen in the final days of his presidency, it does give presidents, by most interpretations, the authority to designate certain areas as protected from that sort of activity. The tricky thing is if a future president wants to walk back a designation made under that statute. And that's basically what we're headed into here, among many other changes in policy. The incoming Trump administration has been very clear that they want to unleash the American energy sector and ramp up energy production. And President Trump himself has said that he's going to look to walk this thing back on day one. Whether or not he'll be able to do so, and I guess it will remain an open question until he gives it a try. But there are some analysts and folks who really know this stuff in greater depth than most people, myself included, who think that the Republican-led Congress can work with the president to walk this back via legislative means. There's some level of dispute as to what instrument, whether it's the Congressional Review Act or something else. But the point remains that Congress may be President Trump's best bet there, and we'll see how that goes. The House caucus, Republicans, they've demonstrated that they have a nasty habit of splintering and fracturing in inopportune moments. But we'll see if Speaker Johnson can hold the caucus together to get big time priority items like this one knocked out and done with.
Well, there's a couple different things, right? And so one thing that you can do with these things is use legislative action. It doesn't even have to be necessarily the Congressional Review Act either. I mean, they could just pass a bill that undoes this, and that bill would become statute, become law. Now, the question is, that type of thing would be subject to a filibuster in the Senate. However, the Congressional Review Act is not. So if this falls under the Congressional Review Act, that might be the most efficacious way of addressing what Joe Biden's doing here with the offshore drilling. One of the things that's interesting about that, though, and this is something that came up in Trump's first term, is that Trump wanted to expand drilling offshore, and some Republican governors weren't terribly happy about that. If I recall correctly, Ron DeSantis was one of them. So this might be one of those issues where you're going to get pretty much unanimous support, or Trump would get unanimous support for trying to reverse the decision that, or the ruling, I guess you could say, or the rule that Biden announced. But it might not lead immediately to action in terms of energy extraction offshore, especially in places like Florida and maybe Georgia, where Republican governors would want to have something to say about that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a good bet that we'll see some strange bedfellows on this. I don't think you can rule out a few Senate Democrats possibly thinking to cross the line and maybe side with President Trump on this. Who knows if they can get as many as would be needed to clear the filibuster hurdle. But yeah, I mean, we'll see how this one shakes out. And I think it's important to note also, just to keep in mind, um, of course, the other priorities for President Trump, um, whether it's the border and fixing the border and beginning the deportation of hardened criminals who have entered the United States in the past several years, whether it's getting inflation under control, extending the 2017 tax cuts. All of these items are central. These are the central kind of tenets of the Trump campaign and the Trump policy playbook. So again, with these relatively tight majorities in both chambers, albeit Republican majorities, it's going to be a tricky minefield for John Thune, the new Senate Majority Leader, and also for Mike Johnson, who's already had his fill of kind of trying to wrangle this fractious House Republican caucus. So, who knows exactly what shape all this is going to take. You have some folks who want all these things done on a standalone basis. You have others that are pushing for a sort of broader, do it all in one go reconciliation package. There are options. I think it's probably a little premature to start guessing, which ones are most likely to play out here, but absolutely something to keep an eye on. And particularly for John Thune, it'll be a nice early test for him, navigating the first 100 days of the Trump presidency with all these various policy priorities that the American people were pretty clear about on November 5th.
Right. And Nick, you're right about that. I would say, though, that this might be a little bit more important than some of the other issues, because part of what Donald Trump wants to do is he wants to get some immediate economic relief. And the fastest way to do that is to ramp up energy production, bring down gasoline prices, which feed into all sorts of different things, including the price of goods at grocery stores, and to get a little bit of relief right up front so that people are aware that, there's a new sheriff in town, sort of thing. So, I mean, this offshore drilling ban thing is kind of a bad signal in that sense. And I know that probably the offshore drilling wasn't going to be an immediate thing anyway, because it takes a while to get that set up. But I think it's a signal. And I think what he's going to be doing is he's going to be signaling that America is really open for business on energy extraction, and fighting this is a really good signal for that.
Yeah, I would agree. And I think, if you ask basically anybody in the energy industry, particularly the, conventional fossil fuels, whether that's the big players, the majors, or, on the other end of the spectrum, independent kind of wildcatters, maybe out there in West Texas, I think basically across the board, you're going to find that everyone is far more enthusiastic and in many ways just kind of relieved about this administration change. The outgoing administration sort of tried to have it both ways, I think, over the years on this particular issue. On the one hand, not going so far as to induce a 1970s level energy crisis domestically, but then on the other, appeasing this very well-funded and well-organized environmentalist lobby that's a key institutional supporter of the Democratic Party today. So, we'll have to see, but President Trump has made quite clear that he wants to drill, baby, drill. It's one of his kind of famous taglines. And interestingly, the Dallas branch of the Federal Reserve actually just came out. They do these surveys every so often. I'm not sure if it's quarterly, but the point remains that one of the first surveys that came out post-election, and if you compared that survey to what these anonymous oil and gas executives and people who really know the business were saying relative to a year or two ago, it's night and day. And maybe because of the sensitivities of politics, you might not get it so candidly from executives who have to play both sides of the fence. But I think the simple truth is pretty clear that not only is overall confidence in the future of the American economy higher today than it was on November 4th, but I think that's holds particularly true with respect to the oil and gas industry and just energy affordability and reliability and all these sorts of things. You know, the private sector feels much more comfortable making these long-term investments,
Exactly.
and going through these lengthy and very onerous regulatory processes to get their system set up. They didn't have the same level of regulatory certainty and steadiness, let's call it, under the Biden administration. So on that front alone, some good relief coming to America's energy producers.
So Nick, the next topic I want to talk about is energy related, right? But it's regulation in a different sector, and that's gas stoves, gas heaters, and that sort of thing. Now, when this topic first came up, we were writing about this too at the time, and I know that you know this because I saw your article on this at Daily Caller. Dailycaller.com, by the way, is where people need to go for these things. And when this first floated up, we were writing about the fact that Democrats were going to try to restrict things like natural gas water heaters, natural gas furnaces, natural gas stoves. And there are a lot of people who cook on those stoves and use natural gas for all of these different, even natural gas dryers for that matter, right? And at the time, we were told that this was misinformation, it was disinformation, it was fake news. Fact checkers, back when fact checkers were a thing, were flagging us for pointing this out. And then, as it turns out, they actually were trying to regulate the use of these and to try to require efficiency standards that were so high as to make them basically impractical any longer. This is hitting the radar screen, I guess, of the incoming Trump administration. So tell us a little bit about what you're seeing and how the Trump administration is going to push back on some of these rule changes that have, I think, just recently come down. And again, the Congressional Review Act would be actually a pretty good, there'd be a pretty good way to use that to roll back most of these. I'm not sure when in the window it falls, when these rule changes were made, but there is an opportunity here for Congress to actually just clear the decks on this and get rid of them. What is the Trump administration doing right now, the incoming Trump administration doing right now?
Yeah, well, reportedly they're weighing some sort of, executive action to, deliberately block off, any sort of regulatory effort to, phase out gas-powered appliances. And, stoves, interestingly, became sort of the hot button issue of this wider trend where you have federal regulators, gradually over time, as you described it, basically setting standards that are too high to be reasonably attained, and therefore, nudging the market to do what the regulators want in the long term, even if it's not really what consumers want. And that's just a general trend. It applies to stoves and dishwashers and pool pump motors and all these sorts of various appliances. So, the Trump administration and this is an issue that, again, this incoming Republican trifecta is aware of and does not like, and I would be surprised if they didn't follow through with some sort of action to stem this trend here. It's a common theme throughout the Biden administration, I would say, on all fronts, really. To go ahead and describe things that may be true but inconveniently so as misinformation. The Department of Energy or the EPA or the White House can, they can split hairs and find ways to technically thread the needle to, back up their claims. But, the simple fact remains that what's in the Federal Register is in the Federal Register. And, industry groups and people who study these things for a living are not necessarily raising the alarm for no reason at all. So in any event, I would be surprised if President Trump did not take a stab at this issue at some point. I don't necessarily think it's quite at the top of the list with some of his other priorities, but nevertheless, it's an interesting thing for him to be interested in and thinking of. And moreover, I think a good point on this too, Ed, is that, and the reason I think it's actually such a salient issue, this whole appliances matter, is that it actually illustrates quite well one of the fundamental problems with climate change policy and the green movement more broadly. Everybody, I think we can all agree we want clean water and clean air for ourselves and our children and so forth. We also do not want, rampant, unregulated corporate pollution and abuse. But at the same time, these climate policies and broad economic, across the entire economy, we're going to decarbonize by 2050, and all these sorts of rules and initiatives, they might sound nice on paper, and this is setting aside how effective they even are. They may sound nice on paper, but when it comes time for them to actually be implemented, there's a lot of top-down selection by regulators and bureaucrats of winners and losers, of do's and don'ts, what you can have, what you can't, all of that sort of thing. So I think, as time has gone on and these targets and policies have shifted from the domain of, fresh press releases into actually at this point policy that's being implemented, people do not, especially ordinary people, do not like this stuff. Whenever it reduces their degree of choice, drives up their bills, that sort of thing. And, I think Europe is, unfortunately for them, several years ahead of us on, climate policy and the transformation of their economy to meet all these goals. And, I think a pretty cursory glance of what's going on over there, particularly in Germany, shows that these policies were not really grounded in reality at all.
Yeah, and I mean, you hit on something I definitely wanted to at least bring up, which is the fact that if you move everything to the grid and government controls the grid, then government can control what it is that you can and can't do in your own house. Whereas independent energy sources allow you a little bit more choice. And I don't really have a problem with electric appliances. My whole house is electric because where I happen to live, this particular section of the town in which I live, they never did run natural gas lines here. So everything's got to be electric in the house. But either that or propane tanks, and electricity is fine for me. But, there's a lot of foodies that really like gas stoves. And a lot of those foodies are not necessarily conservatives. And honestly, I mean, I think that this is so extreme that it's losing Democrats some of what would be their natural organic support, because it's restricting things that their own side likes to do, which is to cook with gas. But yes, so there's that too. But there's also a level of hypocrisy with this, is because natural gas actually does burn clean. If you wanted to have a green energy sort of thing, natural gas is not a bad choice. It beats coal-driven electricity, for instance, by a country mile. Now, I think you could probably do better by using, nuclear supplied electricity, but natural gas burns clean. And so it should fit into a green portfolio if that was the only interest that was going on here. But the interest, I think, and what this shows, is that the interest really isn't in going clean. It's in government control of your energy choices, and therefore government control of the economy. And that's what we're seeing. And that's the reason why we're having economic issues like inflation, because they're trying to push people away from independent sources of power like gasoline for internal combustion engine cars, and forcing people to choose cars that are going to go on the grid to be recharged. And this is something that came up in California, is that California started talking about, I think it was last year, might have been 2 years ago, talking about prioritizing whether or not you could charge your car. And not only that, but also requiring cars to be bi-directional so that they could suck the energy out of your car to supply power back to the grid when it was when there was peak usage times. And that means that you're not going to be able to use your car the next day, potentially. So I think it's more about control than it is about anything to do with emissions. And I'm not sure how you see that.
Yeah, I would generally agree. I do think that there are a fair number of well-intentioned but generally incorrect advocates who back a lot of these positions. And but at the same time, there are folks who understand the grid and understand what it takes to keep a country and an economy like ours running. And what they're seeing, it's pretty grim. The language that's being used, whether it's from independent analysts, whether it's from NERC, which is a big nonpartisan grid watchdog. We're on pace currently for severe problems, and part of that has to do with, for example, no longer, at least in the hopes of the Democrats, no longer will most people be driving gas cars; they'll be driving EVs. Well, you have to plug those in. That chews up electricity, adds more strain to the grid, which is already weak and has been faltering in particular regions of the United States for several years now. And that's before you get into all these data centers that are popping up across the United States, which are incredibly power hungry. I think just recently it was announced that $20 billion of investment may be coming into the United States to fund data centers and related projects, just from one single investor. So either way, with or without the green, all the green appliances and electric vehicles and what have you, the power grid is still an enormous problem. That's it's not the sexiest, it's not the splashiest, and it's not here and now. So in many respects, it flies under the radar compared to other political issues and other non-political issues for that matter. I do think that President Trump has a grasp on this, and that particularly people close to him, experts that he has kind of in his world and orbit, I think are on top of it and understand the grim realities that could possibly await us if we don't get serious about actually adding to the amount of available baseload power and kind of hardening grid infrastructure and all of these sorts of things. We'll see if that can happen. And I wanted to touch too on something you said with respect to natural gas and nuclear. President Trump has mentioned both of those sources of power repeatedly as kind of keys to powering economic development over the coming decade or two. And you are right with respect to the emissions of natural gas. I think another key thing to consider here too is reliability. Solar panels and wind turbines, if they were effective and cost competitive, then maybe we would be seeing more activity in those particular industries without enormous government subsidy and what have you. So those two sources of power are also intermittent, meaning the sun isn't always shining and the wind isn't always blowing. So you have to have intermediate battery technologies that are
that's right.
Some people would tell you are not yet sufficiently advanced to really make sense. You need pretty significant transmission build outs, which unfortunately it takes forever to build anything in America these days. So that is a whole nother can of worms. Overall, again, all this stuff, sure, it sounds great on paper if you don't really know all that much about it, but in practice it's a totally different story. And I think increasingly Americans are starting to kind of figure out that this isn't necessarily a solution to our problems. In fact, it's been said that there are no solutions; there's only trade-offs to these problems. So I think they're starting to realize that, again, this is not necessarily a catch-all solution. This is a policy decision that has trade-offs. And the branding on some of this stuff and the kind of social perception, I think, is starting to shift slowly but surely.
Well, Nick Pope, I want to thank you for joining us to talk about these two things. If you want to find out more, go over to dailycaller.com. And Nick, do you have a Twitter handle? I know you have a Twitter handle because there's a tweet embedded in one of these posts, but maybe you can tell us what it is. And if you're on Facebook or Instagram or anything else like that, where you're sharing your thoughts.
Absolutely. Thanks, Ed. Yeah. So the best place to find me on Twitter is at real Nick Pope, NickPope. You can find my work on thedailycaller.com and also the dailycallerNewsFoundation.org. Thanks again for having me on the show, Ed. I appreciate it.
Nick, great talking with you. We'll do this again sometime soon. Thanks so much for being here.
Fantastic. Thank you.